Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Kwalindun First Nation and the Taan Gwach'an Council. This is a stressful time for Yukoners, for business owners and employees facing hardship and anxiety. I'm sure that we're all experiencing a mix of emotions that may be difficult to express. It's important that we continue to support each other and remember that collaboration and kindness are what makes Yukon strong. Circumstances are evolving, and as we learn more and evaluate, we are responding. The government of Yukon is continuing to identify new support systems to provide for Yukoners in need during this pandemic. We have been collaborating with the Government of Canada to coordinate on how to best help Yukoners. And the Department of Economic Development, our main priority at this time is providing critical resources to support Yukon's economy. This includes our recent changes to the Yukon nominee program, as well as the recently implemented paid sick leave rebate program. I'm here today to announce the next funding program that our department is providing to businesses. The Government of Yukon is now offering the Temporary Support for Events Funding Program. This program is designed to help those businesses that had made investments for large-scale events in Yukon that couldn't take place because of COVID-19. The Events Funding Program is specifically intended to reduce losses involving perishable goods or the cancellation of accommodation and services that cannot be recovered. As an example of this would be a restaurant that purchased much higher amount of food supplies ahead of the Arctic Winter Games or the Yukon Native Hockey Tournament that may have then gone to waste. Other examples could include advertising expenses for the event, service bookings, contracts with vendors, or the cost of hiring new staff specifically in preparation for the event. This program applies to any event canceled due to COVID-19 between March 7th and July 31st that was expected to have more than 50 participants. It is important to note that these expenses must have occurred before the Chief Medical Officer of Health made recommendations to ban gatherings of over 50 people on March 16th. Eligible businesses are also required to make efforts to return supplies, cancel contracts, and limit losses before applying for this program. Funding will be available to cover up to 100% of these irretrievable losses. While the loss of these large gatherings is disappointing to all Yukoners, the negative impact is especially heavy for businesses that invested in these preparations. The program will reduce some of their burden during a period that is already hurting Yukon's businesses. As I mentioned earlier, circumstances are evolving, and as we learn more and evaluate, we are responding. We are listening to the Business Advisory Council and continuing to address the challenges our economy is facing. The Department of Economic Development will keep working with local businesses and adapt as we navigate this changing economic landscape. The newly formed Business Advisory Council are in direct contact with Yukon businesses, and our comprehensive surveys measuring the impact of COVID-19 all inform our government's response. These relationships are important and are helping to guide how we address the impacts of COVID-19. In closing, I'd like to remind all Yukoners to continue to follow the recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, maintain social distancing and regular hand washing, and I understand the Chief Medical Officer of Health will be addressing us here shortly, so I won't take up too much more time, but open to questions on our announcement today or concerning the economy in general.
We'll start in the room. I just wanted to ask, two First Nations have come forward. White River First Nation has called for a cease of mining activity across the territory, particularly in their traditional territories. Najoniak Dun has asked for a temporary halt to prospecting and staking in their traditional territories. Will you stop mining?
First of all, Julian, thank you for that question. And I think it's important for us as Yukoners to ensure that we have accurate facts on these situations. So I first, over the last couple of weeks, but I mean primarily when the announcement was made by the Chief Medical Officer that anybody coming into the Yukon, whether they're working at construction or they're working in retail or they're working in mining, had an obligation to self-isolate for 14 days. And actually, there's a lot of Yukoners that work in northern British Columbia. There are local companies that do work there in the mining sector, and even those individuals that were working in northern BC, as soon as they came into the Yukon, were directed to go directly home and self-isolate for 14 days. So I only bring that up because it's an important fact. There's been some op-eds in the newspaper. There's been conversations on social media. And in all of those cases, the facts were skewed. It said that the mining sector was getting a special pass. And that's not correct. Anybody coming into our territory has been directed by the Chief Medical Officer to self-isolate for 14 days. The two operating mines, Minto Mine and Victoria Gold, have taken this conversation and the measures extremely seriously. They have both hired medical consulting firms that work in the industrial field, and those individuals have been in contact with the Chief Medical Officer. Now, I did an interview earlier today on CBC and I used the word complex, and it's probably not fair to Yukoners to just say it's complex and not delineate that. So let me give just a few examples, and I will to answer your point. There's an overarching conversation here about how we can't let individuals come in the mining sector into our territory because it's going to put us at more risk. So first of all, again, anybody coming into this territory, no matter what their field of work, have that obligation to ensure they're healthy people. And that's something we've shared with that industry, and we'll share it with all industries. But we also have Yukoners that are my neighbors and your neighbors, and some of them are prospectors, some of them are placer miners, and in that case, those individuals may be in their house in Porter Creek or Copper Ridge or Haines Junction. They're healthy people, and they're not in self-isolation, and they're going to go out to their claim and set up their wall tent or their trailer and stay out there and work. And that's what they want to do. And so that's the complexity of it. To say that we got to make sure that nobody else comes into this territory and doesn't mine would make it a very difficult piece, because there's a ton of Yukoners that are going to get ready to want to go and do their work. And they're safe. There has been some people in the industry, primarily, and I touched on it today, some placer miners that have come to the Yukon and have not followed the rules that have been outlined. And I say to them, a small group of people are causing a lot of fear and discomfort in our territory. So follow the rules. They're very clear. Self-isolate for 14 days. Don't put communities like Dawson on alert because of that. As for Nachanite Dun, I spoke with Chief Mervyn this morning, and we talked about the resolution that had been passed. The First Nation Chief and Council passed a resolution and stated they wanted to ensure that there was a cease of activity on their settlement lands. And I heard that loud and clear. And they are ensuring, and they've been communicating with people that mine in that region, and they've been sharing that information, saying that that's their position. What I heard today was that there's some concerns in their community and from their First Nation about how to ensure, as we go forward, that the proper steps are in place and the proper measures are in place to ensure that their community is safe. And they still have some concerns. I can say that my colleagues that are here with us, and in cabinet are moving very quickly, and we're probably going to hear about some measures very soon. I won't preempt that, but I will say very soon. And I think that that's going to lead to some more comfort around ensuring we keep people safe. I think for anybody in the sector, whether you're a prospector or you're a placer miner, what you have to understand is people in all of our rural communities are very uncomfortable at this point. If you are, at this time, we have not suspended that exploration activity. Get your materials, get your supplies, go to where you need to work away from people, and understand that all of our small communities are at a heightened alert right now because of this. So I felt that we had a good conversation. I felt that myself and my colleagues have some work to do to ensure that we have, and we work with industry to get to the right place concerning the comments and action I've done. Concerning the letter from White River First Nation, which was really structured to talk about their traditional territory, but it also was supporting Nachanai Dun. In that case, again, I think that we, have heard their position. Well, I have, but the complexity is this: White River First Nation has asserted traditional territory that goes and overlaps Trondakowichan, Kawanni First Nation, Selkirk First Nation, and Little Salmon Carmacks. So in all those cases, we're going to continue to work with those other 4 nations. I have not had any direct communication from the other 4 nations about how they want to see activities undertaken. I do know that in the case of Minto, they have had, as I've been informed, appropriate and respectful communication with Selkirk First Nation, and they work on their traditional territory. I know that Minto had made a decision to pay the employees that are from Selkirk First Nation and Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation and let them go home at this time. So I have read the letter, and I've saw it on social media, and then I did receive it as well from White River First Nation. And I would say at this point, we are not suspending mining because I am following the direction of the Chief Medical Officer. But I really think it's important when people are putting stuff on social media, or they're, like I saw it today quickly after my interview, understand the facts. The facts are that people are directed, whether they're in construction or retail, or they're an accountant that's traveling into our territory. They have to self-isolate for 14 days. Our prerogative is health and safety first. So I know that's a very long answer, but I think that it's really been time to have this discussion and to ensure that the people that are in those communities are healthy. And we're going to continue to work. I know the Premier had a call with multiple First Nations leaders today. And I think over the next couple of days, we're going to see some measures that are going to be able to give some more comfort to people.
I just have a quick follow-up, and I just
Absolutely.
want to know what is going into the decision to keep mines operating like Eagle Gold?
Again, there's a series of different, and thank you for that question, because there is a number of industries at this particular time, whether it's construction or it's mining or it's, you name it, where we've identified as these are essential services. It doesn't mean that they get a pass, which has been talked about in our community, that these individuals don't have to self-isolate for 14 days. So right now, what's happened is the Chief Medical Officer has done a fabulous job of having to compile a lot of data very quickly to have a look at all the different activity in our territory, and to say these particular activities, they don't get a special pass. Like they essentially have to do self-isolation. So we're not differentiating between Victoria Gold, a prospector, or somebody building a house. These are activities that are happening at this particular time until we hear otherwise. So I think that just to thank you for asking me those questions. And once again, I urge anybody who's going to, go on social media, write to the newspaper, whatever you may do, please, let's have the facts there. And because when we don't, it definitely causes fear in our communities.
Hi, it's Cam Heek, Government of Yukon. just had one of the journalists with Whitehorse Star was having some challenges getting through our landline, so she's asked me to ask a question on her behalf.
Okay.
The question is, does funding cover the cost of anticipated profits? For example, canceled hotel room bookings. If businesses are asked to cancel contracts before applying, so are those contractors also eligible to apply for funding? I can repeat it if you'd like.
On the announcement today, I think, Kim, I would say it's the real focus is irretrievable costs. And I think that's a key statement in what we're talking about. It is decisions that were made on particular items, whether they were perishable or there was money spent on marketing your event, and also as an NGO, some of the costs that you might have laid out. So I think in the case of, I believe, some accommodations, and in the case of our local airline, they're in a position to be able to apply. I mean, there's still a rigor that will happen, and there's a criteria we'll go through. But really, I think it's important to go through the application process. But really, that's the goal of this. I mean, we made an announcement very early on that talked about the cancellation of the Arctic Winter Games, and we also felt it was fair to encompass other events. What I will share for the media is if you need to get your process started for your application, and that can start today, the phone number to call is 456-3803. Our toll-free number for the Department of Economic Development is 1-800-661-0408, extension 3803. And the email address is ecdev@gov.yk.ca. So please begin to, if you meet the criteria that we've talked about today, or you were an organization, please start that process at this point in time.
Okay, and on behalf of Gabriel, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go to the phone now, starting with Yukon News. Gord, do you have a question?
Yes. Could there be any enforcement or monitoring of mines that are not, I guess, cooperating, or miners that aren't cooperating with the self-isolation orders?
Good. When it comes to the two producing mines that are in the Yukon, Minto Mine and Victoria Gold, what we have seen has been great respect for the 14-day isolation process and following through on what the Chief Medical Officer has prescribed. Shortly after, I believe it was the 22nd of March, and I'm sorry if I'm off by a day, was at the point where the Chief Medical Officer was a Sunday and really defined that 14-day rule. The day after that announcement, Minto Mine had, I believe, 30 people fly into the Yukon. And in that particular situation, we spoke with their team and their management team, and they were ready to move their individuals into their mine, and we clearly explained the rules that were in place, and absolutely they followed it. Those individuals, some of those individuals went home, and other individuals have been in self-isolation since that point in time. And the same with Victoria Gold. I think there was 2 or 3 people they had that they needed on site, and we again had to communicate to them that those individuals have to be. So in both of those cases of our producing mines, we've been very comfortable with the respect to the self-isolation and the rules that are in place. Where we have seen some challenges has been around very few bad actors around on the placer mining side of things. I think it's important to commend the Klondike Placer Miners Association and their president, who's a Dawsonite, Will Fellers, individuals who are working with the municipality on a daily basis to ensure that people follow the appropriate rules, people that had come into the Yukon. So I think, you know, in both of those cases, that's what we've realized on the ground. When it comes to exploration, a lot of that work has not happened yet. And in many cases, some of that early work would be done by Yukoners. What we're really seeing is a trend across the entire that entire industry where people are on hold because of, I don't think we have to get into the reasons why, we all know why. So at this point, we've been very comfortable with our producing mines. I do think it's important to share two other pieces of information today. One is that we do have sites that are where there's reclamation undertaken, whether it be Faro, Quetzal River, Wolverine, Mount Nansen. And in all of those cases, we need people on site to ensure the health and safety of our environment. In many cases, they're treating water. We're moving towards spring freshet, and that's going to have a series of other challenges. So it's important to know when people talk about, again, mining, in some cases we have people that are doing environmental work in those particular sites, and we're going to need to have people there as well. I think it's also, the other point I would say is when people talk about our bigger producing mines, and some comments have been made by individuals in our community to say, just shut it down. It doesn't, as we all know, it doesn't just shut down. You don't turn the lights off and leave an operation of that size. There is still an obligation to have people on the ground. There's still an obligation to have other types of work done. So it's not like we can just leave a particular site and nobody will be there until this is over. In any case, there's going to be people there. It's depending on what type of activity they're going to be undertaking while they're there.
All right, we'll go to Tim, CKRW.
Hello, Minister Pillai. I just wanted to get some reaction from you. There's some staggering numbers coming out of the Whitehorse Chamber of Commerce, a business survey that they did toward the end of last month. That 88% of respondents felt some level of impact on their business. 52% said that they had hoped to weather the situation. And the figure sticks out for me. 7% of the businesses that responded said that at the end of April, they pretty much weren't going to make it. Just your reaction to those numbers in the survey.
Yeah, the numbers that are coming in, whether it be the Whitehorse Chamber or the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Canadian Chamber of Commerce, they're all very bleak. So, not shocked. I think for many, there's just a tremendous amount of entrepreneurs in our community that are living this right now and are looking for the measures that are going to provide them with some hope. When I look at what's played out, I think maybe, Tim, the most valuable thing I can do is, touch upon what our strategy is for this. And that really focuses first and foremost, we're trying to ensure that we don't duplicate the efforts of the federal government. And so what we've watched is we've seen the loan program, and we know that is it's still going to take a little bit of time to get that out the door in this month, is what we've heard. We think that that's a valuable tool, not for everybody, but for some. We know that there has been this emergency, and I apologize, I'm not using the proper terminology, but there's a program in place through the federal government to provide people with a bit of a salary, especially even entrepreneurs that are not eligible for unemployment insurance. And so I think that that's a really important piece of this. And then we know that a very substantial investment was made around the wage subsidy, which is going to help some, but not everybody. So those are the three key items. For those many, many businesses that you touched on, Tim, that are saying at the end of April, we're in a very difficult position. My message to you today is this. We, as a government, we are very aware that today was rent day and the additional pressures. I asked the landlords of commercial tenants to sit with your tenants, communicate with your tenants, and provide some flexibility if you can. And I know that's not for everybody, but if you can, sit down and come up with a plan. Secondly, I say to the entrepreneurs that are in the community, it's really, we hear you loud and clear. Our business advisory group met on Friday. There was some recommendations that I received on Sunday night, and it's really focused on fixed costs. And we've been looking that over and trying to define a set of measures that can work with that. The magnitude of this for us is we think it's as high as 4,000 businesses that potentially we have to work with. That could be the high number on this one. And what we did today was an announcement. It's been about 15 days since we all sat in a room and the Arctic Winter Games were canceled, and we pondered if that was a good decision. Now we're in a much different world just a short 3 weeks later. So this commitment today and moving money into the economy was part of that early piece. That might seem like a lifetime ago, but this is work we committed to and we wanted to get done. So to Tim, I would say when people are sitting there today, probably in a pretty difficult position, because I've heard from a tremendous amount of small businesses, entrepreneurs, the personal services sector, you name it. I would say, please, before you make any significant decisions right now, please contemplate the fact that there's more measures coming from the government. We are working lockstep with CanNor to understand and the federal government to understand what they're going to put in place and what we can put in place, and our teams are working tirelessly to ensure that we have those pieces. So we're not there yet. It's going to take a little bit of time. I'm sorry that I have to say it's going to take a little bit of time, but that's the reality of where all of us are right now. This is moving so quick, and the work is tremendous amount of work to do to get it right, or even to get it partially right is probably where we'll land.
All right, we're running short on time, so I'll cycle through the other members on the phone. We have Claudiane. Do you have a question for the minister?
One thing about the mining that I am kind of curious about is for some workers, fly in, fly out, coming from other jurisdictions, they are running into situations where they may not be able to go back or be able to leave. Are there concerns that perhaps the mining sector might not be able to operate properly because of the restrictions on traveling across the country?
Yeah, I'm just pausing because I'm trying to think of exact and specific situations, Claudiane, that I can speak to. I think, again, for the two producing mines in the Yukon, I think that they're very clear on what needs to be done when people get here, where they're coming from across the country. So in those cases, yes, I think that there's concern. I think there's concern in every industry in our country about supply chain, materials needed to do the work, and the gaps in capacity to do it well. So I think our mining industry right now is as well. They're respecting what's playing out, and they're also it's a day-to-day thing for many cases. So I don't see it in a scenario where we're going to have people potentially stuck in the Yukon. I do see a number of different sectors of our economy that are going to have people come to the Yukon, and those people are going to have to self-isolate like any other individual that comes here.
And we'll go to our final question. Just a reminder to media that Dr. Brendan Hanley will speak after this. So our final reporter on the phone is Chris with CBC.
Oh, I'm just here for the next guy.
Wrap it up at that then.
I have
Thank
a
you.
question, Laurent Boreal.
Oh, yep. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this is a question regarding the temporary support event funding. So there are two questions actually. The first one is, why did you choose the date of the July 27th for that funding? You said it would be for events from March 27th to July, March 7th to July 27th. So how did you decide a date in July? And then the other question is that funding apply? Does that funding apply as well for NGOs or only for businesses? Sorry, I figured that I would ask that question in English, not in French.
Repeat it and just confirm your question is, why was the date range selected as it was? And also, why are NGOs included?
If they're included.
If NGOs are included? Okay.
Okay. I think I can answer both questions. I think the answer to your first question, well, maybe a bit vague. I mean, the time period of what becomes an eligible expense is based on, of course, the announcement by the chief medical officer and understanding at that point how things changed. I believe that the Department of Economic Development felt that under the current circumstances and understanding the time frame we're working at, that between now and the end of July really encompassed sort of this period that's really affected by COVID-19, as we understand it now. The second question is, yes, NGOs are eligible for this, for expenses that they incurred for events, and I urge them to reach out to the Department of Economic Development.
Thanks. We'll wrap that here and move on to Dr. Brendan Hanley. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It may seem odd to be describing a new case as good news, but in our latest case, there is good news. Case number 6 is a person from the Whitehorse area who returned as a traveler from Europe within the last 2 weeks. And this individual was already observing self-isolation measures as required prior to onset of symptoms and is doing well in isolation at home. There are some family contacts who are now observing self-isolation as a precaution. All of our cases continue to do well. None has needed medical intervention or support. In fact, 3 of the cases are now fully recovered and have completed their isolation periods. So we're pleased to be able to add the recovered category to our 3 times a week case update on the Yukon COVID website. And we remain therefore in a good position with no cases outside Whitehorse and all cases doing well. Just a little summary in French. Il faut dire qu'il y a beaucoup d'éléments positifs entourant un sixième cas. Il s'agit d'une personne de Whitehorse qui est revenue d'un voyage en Europe au cours des deux dernières semaines. Cette personne respectait comme il se doit les mesures d'auto-isolement bien avant l'apparition des symptômes et à ce moment poursuit son isolement à la maison et se porte bien. De proches de la personne se sont également placés en isolement préventif. D'ailleurs, trois de ces personnes sont maintenant complètement rétablies et ont terminé leur période d'isolement. I know there are many questions remaining about how we are operationalizing some of the recent orders, particularly with regard to people arriving in Yukon from outside the territory. More details will be coming soon, including definitions about where exceptions to self-isolation can be applied. I want to emphasize at this point that where exceptions to self-isolation are considered, the expectation is still self-isolation for these people when they're not at work. Rigorous self-monitoring for symptoms with strict adherence to physical distancing will be required. Self-isolation is otherwise the default expectation for all other workers, including mining camp workers, so that communities can be assured that incoming workers are free of COVID virus. So I just wanted to move beyond that perception of there being an exemption. The self-isolation requirement when there are exceptions is under supervision, under risk assessment, is not an exemption, but has strict self-monitoring requirements that go along with it, and that's for us to be able to continue with critical infrastructure work when required. So details of who is in that category and who is not will be coming shortly in the next few days. As mentioned on today's written announcements, work camp guidelines have now been issued for work camps during this pandemic period. These guidelines include instructions on how to practice safe spacing and other preventive measures at the camp, a guide to food handling, instructions for how to self-isolate at camp if required due to symptoms or in case of contact. And thanks to our friends at Air North, greeters are now in place at the Whitehorse Airport for any arriving airline to ensure travelers are aware of the 14-day isolation requirement and to otherwise ensure that they have the information and support that they need. Passengers are also receiving guidance before they deplane, and COVID-19 information is displayed on airport screens. There have also been lots of questions about what arrangements are in place at the Whitehorse Emergency Shelter. Staff there have been working intensively on adapting the shelter to today's COVID realities. Continuing to support vulnerable people and help to prevent COVID from affecting them is one of our key priorities. Some of the activities include reducing the number of people in the shelter at any one time, actively screening guests for symptoms, providing access to testing where necessary, additional cleaning measures, ensuring accommodation for people who need to self-isolate. I'd also like to salute the many non-governmental organizations who are continuing to provide much-needed services and support, as well to people who are either homeless or at risk for homelessness, while adopting all of the required safety measures to minimize COVID's threat. It's a short update today. That's all I have to offer for now, but I'll be happy to answer questions as best I can.
Okay, if we can take the question in the room first, and then we'll go to the phone lines.
Julian Janak, the Narwhal. I just wanted to ask about these exceptions. You mentioned miners flying in, 14-day isolation period before they can go to the mine. Is that deemed an exception to what could be enforcement of 14-day self-isolation?
For the mines, we have set a bar, and that bar is 14 days of self-isolation before going into the work camps.
And is that
So
an enforcement? Is that being enforced?
yes, that is
Okay.
that is being monitored and enforced.
Okay, and the other question I had was Eagle Gold has 190 people working at that site. Currently, there's, I think, 10 people, no more than 10 people in terms of gatherings. Why doesn't that 10-person rule apply there?
So it's a good question, and it's about gatherings and in this case a mine, but can be generally applied to workplaces. So how does that figure of 10 apply to workplaces? And the gatherings is applied to what we call mass gatherings or social gatherings. So within a workplace, there may well be in a large workspace more than 10, even more than 50 or more people, and it really depends on what the key concern is spacing. So social gatherings are limited to 10 as a blanket public ban to avoid some of those encounters that we find in social gatherings, whether it's spacing that's less than 2 meters, whether it's hugs, whether it's sharing of food, many risk factors that can be associated with social gatherings. If you have a workplace that's large enough with adequate spacing, and you follow the physical distancing rules, then that is not a mass gathering. It's another setting.
Gord at the Yukon News.
Yes, I was wondering if you could clarify what exactly you mean by recovered. Does this mean their virus is gone from their system and they would no longer be contagious and be able to pass on the virus?
So the question is about what does recovered actually mean, and we do actually have a definition of recovered. First of all, it means that the person has to be asymptomatic and have no more symptoms and have been a minimum of 14 days in isolation. So once they have cleared their symptoms and finished their time of isolation, then they are no longer infectious. And there are exceptions. So the exceptions are for instance, hospitalized patients. There are also special considerations for those who work in healthcare settings. But for the purposes of the people that have now been declared recovered, they are symptom-free and they have finished their self-isolation period.
Thank you.
Chris, CBC.
Yeah, hi. Just wondering if Dr. Hanley had any information about whether the NWT's second case that was announced today and is in Inuvik, do we know if that person traveled through Whitehorse to get to Inuvik?
My understanding from Dr. Kendall's announcement of that case is that the person took a flight back to Inuvik. The flight details were not published, but the person did not have symptoms until 5 days after the flight. So even with a very conservative approach to flight contact tracing, regardless of the route of the flight, it would be irrelevant whether that person flew through a Yukon route or through an alternative route to get to Inuvik.
Okay. And my second question is, how much work has your office done to sort of, I guess, build a model to try and examine how serious this outbreak is going to be in the Yukon?
The question is about modeling and how much modeling is being done locally. It's a really good question. We do actually have a small modeling team, and we work very closely with colleagues in British Columbia as well as national counterparts. There are clearly limitations to modeling on our small population, so often it's a matter of projecting modeling exercises in other jurisdictions onto some of our what we know about our own demographics. So yes, we are modeling. We don't have as yet anything to publish on the modeling studies. We will update you as we progress further enough in the modeling to give meaningful public information. But it does allow us another way to look at a number of different scenarios or possible scenarios while we put all of the preparations into place, whether that's ramping up public health capacity, whether it's public measures and the possible impact, or whether it's preparing for surges in demand on our healthcare facilities.
Aurore boréale? We'll come back. Claudiane? Okay, well, while we're trying to figure out where those folks are, we do have a text question from Gabrielle at the Whitehorse Star. If someone at the shelter needs to self-isolate, will they be moved to the isolation center at the High Country?
The question about self-isolation, so there are special provisions being put in place for shelter. So there are actually some special arrangements being made, including rooms at the shelter where self-isolation can occur. So it will depend on the circumstances of that individual person, depending on their own circumstances and our ability to follow up with that person. So depending on the needs and the circumstances around that person, it could be a number of settings. Those who are certainly more vulnerable that need more intense support would be housed at the shelter itself.
Okay, she has one follow-up question. If someone with an addiction is asked to self-isolate, will supports be put in place to ensure someone is not going through withdrawal while in isolation?
Yes.
That was easy. Can we go back to the phone lines? Do we have Aurore boréale?
Yes. Ma question, il y a beaucoup de personnes je connais, ils s'inquiètent de la frontière de l'Alaska et à quel moment pourrait fermer la frontière.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up very badly. We can't get the question.
Maybe it's better now.
Yes.
C'est une question au sujet de la frontière. Beaucoup de Yukonais s'inquiètent au sujet de la frontière entre le Yukon et l'Alaska. À quel moment le docteur Hanley pourrait décider de fermer la frontière?
C'est une question de la frontière entre Alaska et Canada. Et this is a question about the border between Alaska and Canada. So that is a federal matter, and as you know, there are already restrictions in place for non-essential travel between the U.S. and Canada, which also apply to Alaska. Donc c'est sous les règlements fédéraux et comme vous savez, il y a déjà des règlements en place pour limiter la circulation de trafic, de mouvement entre les frontières entre Alaska et les États-Unis et le Canada, incluant le cas de Alaska-Yukon.
Claudiane?
I'm good, thank you.
She's good. Are there any other questions on the line?
Yes, it's Tim from CKRW. I have a question.
Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
Dr. Hanley, I'm just wondering, with stepped-up announcements regarding PPEs across the country, the federal government had said that 500 ventilators would be able to be delivered across Canada in early April. We've seen the donation of masks from Suncor Energy as well on the weekend. But I guess what is Yukon's kind of piece of the equipment? Are you, getting, for lack of a better term, getting your hand in there and trying to get some of that equipment here to the territory?
Question about getting PPE, ventilators, other supplies from federal sources. So yes, absolutely. We're in very active, very intense discussions with federal government and with our counterparts, also with our northern counterparts, on acquiring supplies through the current federal bulk purchase, as well as various other arrangements. So we have centralized acquisition of PPE now, which includes the hospitals and health and social services, and as well as being able to supply where needed for community needs. So we now have a centralized process. We're developing guidelines for use of PPE in various settings, whether community settings or acute healthcare settings. At the moment, we feel very confident about our role and our ability to get our fair share, as it were, of PPE. Ventilators is another process, but there is a separate process for ventilators. As you know, it's not just a matter of ventilators, it's about the whole critical care capacity, including staff, including oxygen supply, including the consumables associated with ventilators. So, and again, another very, very active area of search planning. And again, a reminder that the biggest saver on critical care need will be the public health measures. So by limiting the spread of COVID, by dampening down, flattening that curve as much as we can, that is going to be our biggest answer to critical care needs. At the same time, we're making all of those preparations based on various scenarios.
We have time for
Just
two.
a quick follow-up.
Okay. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Sourcing any other areas? Okay, sorry. Are you sourcing any other areas other than the High Country Inn, like for potential space?
There are. I can't give you details on that, Tim. It's a little out of my arm's length, but I know that there are active discussions for alternative places should the High Country reach capacity.
Thank you.
Okay. Julian, you had a question?
Okay, so no spread in the communities yet. Are you concerned at this point about possible community spread or community members being infected by COVID?
So the question is, am I concerned? So I'm going to interpret that as, do I worry about community spread? Yes. I mean, our aim is to stop community spread at its source. But I am confident that we do not have community spread at the moment. So, and the way that we are looking for it and anticipating it is by aggressive testing, by having even more focused testing in rural areas, and in carrying out that active surveillance, as well as preparing our communities with active conversations with our communities, as well as our community health nurses, so that all are confident that should there be a case that appears in the community, that we can contain that case equally well in a community as in Whitehorse. So the appearance, of course, when I say community spread, I just want to be clear on what that means. That means that spread wherever in Yukon would be from one person to another without it being associated with a travel imported case, and we're not at that point yet. So that's different from a case appearing in the communities, which, although all of our cases so far have been in the Whitehorse area, it's just as possible that we would have a travel associated case appearing in a community. But that our strategy would still, in that case, be just like we're doing now, containment self-isolation. And so that would not in itself indicate necessarily any change in public risk or community transmission.
We have time for one more question. Does anyone on the line have one? Hearing nothing, thank you very much, folks.